In this section, we're going to be looking at a monitoring tool called Application Insights. Before we dive into Application Insights, let's take a step back and look at Azure Monitor as a whole. It is a central location to monitor all resources within Azure. This includes the monitoring of activity within Azure itself. This is nice because if you're already in Azure looking at your resources, you can now see the various metrics about the resource in the same location. At the same time, you also need to be able to identify issues as they arise. There are a few different ways that Azure helps simplify this, and we'll look specifically at how Application Insights helps with this in just a bit. And finally, monitoring information is extremely helpful, but being able to sound the alarm when an event happens is more important in my opinion. Within Azure, you can create an alert to send notifications, or you can have it start a predefined task to auto-remediate issues as well. I love this image because it really helps paint the picture for Azure Monitor. We can see on the left we have a variety of resources and resource types that can send information to Azure. This includes your various resources in Azure, your IaaS VMs, your applications, Azure subscriptions and tenants, and also application and VM that live outside of Azure. It is then broken down into metrics and logs. Metrics are point-in-time information, say CPU percentage, or HTTP response time. Logs, on the other hand, are essentially messages that can contain a variety of information, maybe an event log entry from a Windows VM or an access log from Azure Front Door. And then on the right, we have all the ways that we can process this information. We can use Power BI to visualize the data. We can create alerts to send notifications or to start auto-remediation tasks. And then we can also leverage Application Insights to help understand what's happening with that data. Application Insights is a feature that gives us the ability to see how traffic is moving within our applications. By using this data, it helps paint a picture of how the application is performing and make it easier to understand any bottlenecks or problem areas. Some examples of this information could be the request rates and the response times, and also looks at the dependency request rates and response time to see how long the backend might be taking to respond. Application Insights leverages an SDK to gather the information. This can be installed on most resources within Azure by simply selecting Enable Application Insights. This is also known as a codeless deployment, since we don't need to do anything with the application code to have it report the data to Application Insights. They also have a code-based deployment that does require some changes to the code, as the name would imply. By using this, it means we can enable Application Insights for non-Azure resources, so you can utilize it for all of your workloads. All the data in Application Insights is stored in Log Analytics. Not only does this provide a robust backend, but it also gives us the ability to review the data if we need to find some specific information that might not be available within Application Insights. And then we can also create a custom report based upon that if needed. One of my favorite features within Application Insights is the application map. The application map gives us details about each of the components of an application. This becomes incredibly useful as we leverage distributed applications where we have process occurring on multiple resources. By providing details not only about the components, but specific requests, you can see that your application worked fine for most of the requests, but there are a handful that are having consistently higher response times. This can help you understand if there's something that isn't optimized or is perhaps undersized, and you need to investigate that further. As we can see in this example of an application map, we have a web app and a SQL database backend. This is the nJAP01 web app instance that we've used for the past few demonstrations. We can see on the right we have the slowest requests by name, and we can see we've got the two GET requests that are pretty consistent, but then we have a POST request, which is about double the response time. If we think about it, that makes sense because GET doesn't have any writes, whereas a POST does. So as we look at this, it can help understand where any potential issues lie. If we had problems with our SQL database backend, we could see that the response time there is typically going to be much higher, or is going to be a larger portion of the overall time. So maybe we need to look at investigating how our performance is on our SQL database versus on the web app. As you're monitoring traffic on your website, it can be really helpful to see how your users are interacting with it. Here are a few of the ways that Application Insights can help you understand your user's experience. The funnel helps you determine if your users are completing the entire process, whether they're completing a sale or filling out an application. If they're exiting before it is completed, it can be helpful to know that and also where that is happening. User flows is much in the same breath. You want to see how your users are interacting with your site and how they're browsing it. Using this information can help understand and adjust how your site is laid out to improve navigation. Impact is measuring to see how load times are affecting if a user will continue using your application or not. If you have a high load times, your users may be less likely to continue using that application. Conversely, fast load times would typically keep your users more engaged. Retention is measuring how many times the user is coming back. If you have a lot of one-hit wonders, that may make the case that your site needs to be restructured. But if you have a high retention, this supports the argument that any changes need to be more carefully reviewed. Cohorts then helps paint the picture for what users have in common. Maybe you have a group of users that visit a page with a high frequency. These users may also be interested in another feature that is similar. It may make sense to have that second feature more visible from the first page to help drive up its usage. One thing worth noting is that if you want to enable these features, you need to ensure that your web app has always on enabled. This is to help prevent that web app from being unloaded due to inactivity. Now that we've talked about Application Insights, let's talk about how it's deployed. As we mentioned earlier, there are two ways to deploy Application Insights. The first and probably easiest way is what Microsoft calls the codeless deployment. This is available to only certain resources within Azure, and it's simply enabled by selecting the option to enable Application Insights. It's essentially a push button deployment. The next option that we have is a more universal approach, and that's called a code-based deployment. With a code-based deployment, you need to have an existing Application Insights instance already set up. Within Application Insights, there's a unique field called Instrumentation Key. We use the Instrumentation Key to uniquely identify each Application Insights instance. So when we configure a code-based deployment, we use that Instrumentation Key so that the application knows what's Application Insights instance to write back to. Once we have the Instrumentation Key, we also need to install the appropriate Application Insights package. There are packages for ASP.NET, .NET Core, Java, Node, Python, as well as non-HTTP based applications. With the package installed, we define the instrumentation key and then specify the logging level. As we can see in this example for ASP.NET, we've got the Application Insights instrumentation key, and then we also have the logging level. One thing worth noting if we learn from key vaults is we probably shouldn't put the instrumentation key right there within the code itself. We should probably create a reference to it, shouldn't we? Now that we've talked about Application Insights, let's see how we can leverage it for an existing web app and then what kind of data that can provide. So here we are back in the Azure portal, and what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Application Insights. We can see it here under our recently accessed, or if it's not listed there, we can always go up top and search for application, and then we can see it showing up here in one of the first few items. So let's go ahead and select that, and you can see we do have an existing Application Insights instance there today, but let's go through the process of adding a new one. So if we go up here and click Add, and then we're going to go through the familiar screen again to where we select the resource group of Skylines. We're going to give it a name of Skylines App Insights. We're going to go ahead and select the East US region, and we are going to use a resource mode of workspace based. And what this is going to do is it's basically going to save all the information in Log Analytics. So to do that, let's go ahead and select an existing Log Analytics instance. And we'll go click on Next to review the tags, which we're not going to define for this example. Review and create. Everything looks good, so now we're going to go ahead and select Create. So while that's creating in the background, let's go back and take a look at that existing Application Insights instance. And once we're here, one of the first things we notice is the instrumentation key. And the instrumentation key, again, is that unique identifier for this Application Insights instance. So as we're using a code-based deployment, we're going to use that instrumentation key to tell that application which specific instance of Application Insights we're going to be sending that to. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the features within Application Insights. If we scroll off to the left, under Investigate, we see Application Map. And again, this looks very similar to that example that we saw in the PowerPoints. We do have our web app, IngApp01, which we've been working with, which is talking to the IngSQL01 database engine. And if we go through and take a look, if we select this, you can see what some of the calls are that we've been experiencing as well as the response times. Or if we go through and take a look here, you can also see the typical response time for the SQL backend. So this is really good information, but let's go ahead and take a look at one with a little more history. So let's go ahead and look at the last 30 days. And here you can see, we have a number of calls, but we also have some failures here. So let's go ahead and take a look at those failures and select that. And again, we'll select the response codes here, and we'll select the first suggested. And if we go through here and click this one and scroll down, you can see we've got an error where the login failed. And if we click Show More, we're going to get the full stack here. But you can see the second line down where we've got login failed for user Joe admin. This is an example of an error we would get if we had some sort of issue talking to the backend. So if the part of that connection screen, if there was a bad password listed, this might help explain it, or this would help give you some insight as far as what happened, and then how do I dive into that to find out more information. So if we close out of this and then go back to the application insights, again, this is a really good tool because not only does it help you see how things are working, but if there's errors, it also helps you to dive in to see where those errors are occurring and also provide some logs so you can dive into that error a little further. So let's also take a look now at one of the other options, which is live metrics. So if we select this, this is going to take a few seconds to spin up. But what this is doing is this is basically a live stream of information that's happening on your application. So this is looking, you can see right now we don't have any data going on here. But if we go back to that web app, let's go ahead and edit the details here. And we'll call this request 8, save. And then if we go back, now we can see those requests happening. So you can see we had the initial request and then we saved it. You can see any failure rates that were happening, dependency calls, which again, as we're writing to that SQL database backend, memory utilization, CPU utilization. So this again gives you helpful insight to where you can, if you're having an issue at real time, you can use this to help see if maybe it is a CPU constraint or a memory constraint or response times to various parts throughout the process. Just one more tool that you can have to help you troubleshoot as issues come up. Additionally, if we scroll down here, you can see we've got a number of the usage options. So these would be the funnels and user flows and so on and so forth that we talked about in the PowerPoints. And then finally, one last thing I wanted to point out, if we go to properties here, again, we've got our instrumentation key as well as a connection string that we might need to use depending on the resource or how that information needs to be provided. And then one last thing, if we look at the logs, we are using a log analytics workspace on the back end. So hopefully this helps explain application insights and some of the ways that you can utilize it to help troubleshoot and monitor your resources within Azure.